Can't take your cards.
It's a public document. That's a public document, sir. Turn in the cards, they're public documents.
Morning, today is Tuesday, January 23rd, 2018.
That is a public document. Turn in my cards.
This is a regular meeting of the Board of Police Commissioners. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Good morning. Let the record reflect Commissioners Sobroff, Johnson, Figueroa Villa, and McLean Hill, and Goldsmith are present, and we have a quorum. Number one on the agenda, consent agenda items.
Do we have any comments?
We have none,
Commissioners?
sir.
Any public comments?
None, sir.
Okay, I'll move items 1A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Go to item number 2A, please.
Thank you. Okay. Item, regular agenda items, number 2A, Department's verbal presentation and discussion relative to the year-end 2017 Part 1 crime statistics.
Commissioners, how are you today?
Morning, Chief.
You know, I can certainly do this. The mayor and I did the end of year crime press conference this past Friday, and I'll focus on some of the highlights. You know, first, one of the things that, as you all well know, we've worked very hard this year on reducing homicides and numbers of victims shot. About 63% of our homicides are gang-related, and a similar number of victims shot are due to gang violence. So this is something that we think through community outreach and proper police procedures and targeted patrol functions that we can affect, and we were able to affect it. And for the 8th consecutive year, the city has had under 300 homicides, 282 to be exact this year. 300 homicides is a significant milestone for me because the last chief before me to have under 300 homicides was in 1967. So, you know, when I was a freshman in high school was the last time that Los Angeles had under 300 homicides. And that's significant because in 67, the population of this city was about 1 million less people. Victims shot, we were down 10.2%, 1,059 individuals shot in the city of Los Angeles last year. That is the third lowest number since we've been keeping track. Our lowest number was in 2014 when we had just under 1,000 people shot. Part of the reason for that is number of firearms taken off the street increased by 11%. We took 6,538 firearms off the streets of Los Angeles. That does not include gun buyback numbers. That are all criminal investigations. Of significant interest to all of you, South Bureau has obviously been part of the focus for reducing.
Excuse me, Chief. Mr. Herman, final warning. Can't disrupt the meeting.
South Bureau, the south part of Los Angeles has been a part of our focus, and South Bureau saw the lowest number of homicides since its inception in 1973. And they also had the lowest numbers of victims shot in its recorded history. So that's really significant. They suffered 116 homicides in South Bureau, but that again is the lowest since 73, and that was the first year that South Bureau kept its numbers separate. 510 victims shot, and again lowest since those numbers have been kept. Citywide Part 1 crimes, and I'm going to exclude MTA crimes because MTA wasn't part of our book of business last year, so in order to compare apples to apples, I'll pull the MTA crimes out of the numbers that I give you right now. Excluding MTA crimes, we had a 0.7, less than 1% increase in citywide Part 1 crime. Part 1 crime, of course, is the aggregate of property and violent crime as coded by the Uniform Crime Reporting System that was developed by the FBI in the 30s. It's not the greatest system. It ignores some crimes, but but it is the system that we use, and it is the one that is most applicable when measuring crime over time. Citywide violent crime, excluding MTA, 1.9% increase. You see, this is at odds with the increase, or the decrease of homicides and shooting victims, and also a significant decrease we saw in sexual assaults. And that's because we did have more street level robberies, particularly those where a firearm was not used, and such items as jewelry or phones were taken. And we also had a incremental increase in aggravated assaults, primarily at the lower end, where no weapon was used or a weapon was threatened. So that's a 1.9% increase. To give you an idea of what that means, last year we had 28,818 violent crimes in the city, and this year we had just over 29,000. Citywide property crime, excluding MTA, essentially flat at less than 0.5% increase. The bureaus, when you look at Part 1 crime, the bureaus varied significantly, at least in my experience, a significant variance of a swing of 5%. So Operation Central Bureau, 3.9% increase in Part 1 crime. A lot of that due to issues related to homelessness and homeless crime as victims and as suspects increased by about 10% last year, so it was a significant increase, and most of that was in Central Bureau. South Bureau saw a 1.6% increase in Part 1 crime. West Bureau saw a 3.6% increase in Part 1 crime, and Valley Bureau actually saw a reduction of 1.1% in Part 1 crime. These are all some of the things that I reported in the press conference on Friday. I will add a few things that we are going to report in an upcoming press conference that is specific to homicides. You know, homicides are a crime that, just because of its severity and because of the intensity of the investigations involved, is important to look at, because it shows patterns that emerge in violent crime in the city that are undetectable in other crimes, because they don't have the ability to drill down into the circumstances of the victims as much. But homicides, of the 282 homicides we had last year, we had a clearance rate of 73.4%. That's a really good clearance rate. I think it's the second highest clearance rate we've had in the last decade. You know, I think the detectives and officers in the city of Los Angeles can be proud of that. As we talked about in gang crime, about 63% of the homicides were gang related, and of those homicides where a weapon was used, 93% of those were firearms. The vast majority pistols of medium caliber. You know, the demographics of crime were something that we looked at this year. So I'll talk about that really quickly. Victim gender for homicide, 9 out of 10 victims were male. Probably no surprise to the commission. Victim descent, about of the 282 homicides that we had, more than 53% involved Hispanic victims. 36% involved African American victims. Whites, Asians, and other descents represented about 10% of the total number of homicides. Victim ages. Victims were primarily between the ages of 18 and 35. About 60% of our victims were between those ages. And victim education. 84% of the homicide victims had high school or less than high school education. Victim median household income was 67% of the homicide victims had a median household income of $25,000 or less. The suspect, you know, and of course, obviously we have details on every one of our 282 victims. Not as complete a detail on suspects, but the suspect information closely mirrored the victim profile, which is typical in homicide. Traffic, traffic is a common denominator between all of us, right? Everybody suffers from traffic. Traffic fatalities were something that the city as a family focused on through engineering and enforcement. And I'm happy to report that fatal traffics were down about 6% in the city last year, and that's 16 fewer folks that died in traffic accidents. And that concludes my discussion of crime.
Okay.
Thank you. I just have one comment. When I moved to the city in the early '90s, we were tracking at over 1,200 homicides a year. So the being under 300 for 8 consecutive years is a pretty incredible accomplishment. Well, I joined the police. Sorry, go ahead.
Even if you go back to just 2002, which is only 15 years ago, we had well over 600, so it was double the rate that it is today. So, because I use the 92, 93 numbers also, but people think, well, that was a time long ago, but even this century, we had twice the rate of homicides that we did this year.
Yep. And then I joined the police commission in 2015, and that was in the midst of, there was really an uptick in violent crime, homicides, shooting victims, and it's very good to see that the department was able to not only get that under control, but to reverse that trend. And I'm hopeful that we're heading back down, and we'll continue to stay below 300. So there was some really great work done by the department in the last couple of years to make sure that we were keeping a wrap on violent crime.
Do we have any other commission comments on 5A? There is no action on the report of.
We need public comment.
Right, and then we'll do public comment. Public comment on this item?
We have 3 cards. We have Christine Gatson, followed by Jamie Garcia and Mr. Herman.
Okay. Morning, welcome.
It is not a good morning. Chief Beck, you proudly tout fewer than 300 homicides and shootings, and that shootings are down and sexual assault is down. But I wonder if those numbers include all of the people that your officers have murdered last year, all of the people that your officers have shot or sexually assaulted. While crime is mostly down by your metric anyway, criminalization of low-income communities and communities of color is steadily rising. And I'd really love to understand why homeless crimes are not separated by houseless people who are victims as opposed to houseless people who are suspects. Do you not want us to know how much victimization of houseless individuals has risen?
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Jamie Garcia.
Ms. Garcia.
So I wanted to kind of take us on this journey, right? So in the 2020 plan, you talk about PredPol, or it talks about PredPol being used for violent crime. So let's back up just a little bit, and we have Lillian Carranza stating that there's underreporting of violent crimes in 2014. Then a 2015 audit by the OIG comes out, shows significant number of crimes from 2008 to 2014 were actually aggravated assaults. So I want to talk about this experiment of crime fighting and how it's actually failing. So 30%, crimes were 36%, aggravated assaults were 36% higher each year. So it really calls into question the legitimacy of your crime fighting programs. So specifically looking at predictive policing. So PredPol is based on is a predictive policing program that hotspots communities and is dependent on these crime statistics. And these programs impact people's lives with policing continuing to target Black, brown, and poor communities. So what this tells us is that there is no acknowledgement that the record keeping of crime stats are not only wrong, but they're being used to justify the use of these programs. Studies being done to prove the effectiveness of PredPol are based on these fudged crime statistics. So all this work and hoopla around finding a non-biased way to fight Part 1 crimes is really fabricated. It was under UBEC that these programs were started, where these predictive policing programs were launched, particularly PredPol and Operation Laser. So I'm really turning to you right now, Cynthia McLean-Hill. The community is calling for an investigation on how these crime statistics have affected these programs, and we need to know if PredPol is truly being used for violent crime as well, because all the studies that are being done are looking at PredPol only in the context of property crime. So now that we know that violent crimes are actually being fudged, and in your 2020 plan, you say that PredPol is being used to fight violent crime, so how do we know that these programs are actually legitimate? So it's really
Thank you. You can come back during public comment or during another time and complete. Next speaker.
Mr. Herman?
So you heard, you no longer can accept public comment cards. But once again, how do we discharge so-called incidents? Well, let's start off with the incidents involving a gentleman by the name of Robert Harris Germain. South Park shooting. Let's talk about another gentleman, Christian Nino, in Cypress Park, 22-year-old stab. See, these are not just incidents that just happen by far what you don't know. These are incidents publicly corrected by the two public speakers before me as they addressed their issues, and they stated facts. See, I can't state a fact because my opinion can't be recorded on a public comment card anymore, so there's no fact to that. And you need to let the public know that you can no longer bring public comment cards such as these in the effort to discharge a public speaker simply for submitting a public comment card containing information of unsolved murders, unsolved incidents of police engagement with the public, and so forth. Now, whether or not I become an issue of an officer-involved shooting depends on your action. I'm glad to hear that our Chief of Beck, no longer Chief of Beck, but the pertaining time allotted him till June is something I find offensive because, as indicated, the history behind Chief Beck is that he wants to be home with his grandchildren, and so do I. And because of my public comment cards suggest that police shouldn't be sleeping with children, continues to be a problem with the police department, LAPD, for the record.
We have no other comment cards, sir.
Okay, that is not an actionable item, so we'll move on to, I want to take out of order item number D, because I don't believe that, does anyone want to see a report or have any questions, or can we move right to public comment on D? We do have some discussion on B and C. Okay, let's take,
We have one public comment card. We have Adam Smith.
Mr. Smith? This is regarding 2D, risk management, harm reduction.
I don't have much to say about it because the link on the website for this agenda doesn't work. So I don't think you guys should be able to vote on it since we weren't able to look at it.
We have no other comment cards, sir.
I'll move item 2D.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, let's go to item 2B. Department's report. Morning, sir. Morning.
This is Department's report relative to the supervisory cross-training and monitoring and mentoring program follow-up report.
Go right to questions.
No, I want to report.
Oh, do you want the report? Okay, so let's go ahead with the report.
Okay, good morning. Dan Randolph, Commanding Officer, Training Division. I know you've had a chance to review the fact sheet, so I won't repeat it. With all due respect, I'll go over some of the highlights of perhaps the supervisory cross-training program to begin with. Currently, in its current state, it's intra-area. It relies heavily on kind of the stars being aligned, so to speak, with having a detective and a sergeant supervisor swap places for a year. We're recommending that it be downgraded to 6 months and that we open it up to intra-bureau. We think that the commands within the bureaus would certainly very manageable. We also think that this would give our employees a great deal more opportunity to participate in this program should they choose. Honestly, we don't know definitively what it's looked like over the last 8 years. We have anecdotal information on participation. But I can tell you, because of the Hunter LaLake consent decree, we knew from 1997 to the year 2010, over those 13 years, we had very little participation. We had one year that was, we had 11 participants citywide. We had another year with as low as 0. The average was, it was single-digit participation. The average was about 5.5 to 6 persons participating in this program, so very low participation. Based on that, as we go forward, moving into revitalizing this program, should we see a significant uptick, then perhaps you saw one of my recommendations about utilizing ITB to form an electronic program to track. Quite frankly, I don't think that's really necessary at this point. I think it's something that the bureaus can track. If we're talking about 6 people over a year, I think it's very doable in that sense. I would like our